Welcome to another College of Communications digital video tutorial. We will be looking at the basic features of the Nikon D7000 digital SLR camera in this tutorial. The camera is available through MediaTek. The D7000 offers a host of features, options. It can produce really great pictures, both still photos and videos, but it's also a very complicated beast. So if you're new to using the camera, you want to make sure to set up properly before you start an assignment. Think of pilots going through their pre-flight checklist. If you don't want to crash and burn, metaphorically, then use this video and the accompanying D7000 cheat sheet as your pre-flight checklist. This is not an everything you always wanted to know about the D7000 but were afraid to ask tutorial, but hopefully it will cover enough of the basics to get you out the door and using the camera. The camera kit you get from MediaTek will include the camera body, an attached 18-105 zoom lens, a charger for the camera battery, a camera manual hidden behind the foam in the lid of the box. I should say, if you're thinking of buying a camera, that Nikon has just introduced the D7100, an updated version of the D7000. If you buy the D7100, it has a few changes and improvements, but most of the controls are very similar to the D7000. So let's work our way through this pre-assignment checklist. My suggestion is you print out the handout or make notes for yourself and go through that checklist the first few times you sign out the camera to make sure you've got all the settings set properly. First, the battery compartment. It's on the bottom of the camera. You pull back the little switch, the door opens, there's a small lever, you can pop out the battery. Check the battery level on the top of the camera before heading out on an assignment. To turn the camera on, there's a slider around the shutter release button on the top of the camera. Rotate that button to the on position. The first thing you want to do if you've just signed out the camera is reset all the camera settings. Who knows what the last student was doing with the camera? Don't find out the hard way. There are two buttons with green dots next to them, one on the top right of the camera and one on the back of the camera lower left. Press them simultaneously and hold them until the display on the top of the camera flashes. This resets the camera to its default settings. Next, you want to erase and format the SD card. This deletes everything on the card, so don't do this if you've been using the camera. The idea is to start with a clean slate. Formatting the card also cleans up its internal lists and codes, making it less likely that something will go wrong. The SD card holds all the photos that you take, and it's stored on the side of the camera. Slide open the door, press on the card. It's spring-loaded and should pop out. You'll see there are two slots for SD cards. If you are on a long shoot or doing video, you might put a card in each to hold more photos. The 16 gig card supplied by MediaTek will hold a large number of images. The exact number depends on the quality settings you've set, but you should be fine for most assignments. Formatting the card is a two-step process because Nikon doesn't want you accidentally deleting everything on your card. There are two buttons with the word Format in red next to them. One is on top of the camera next to the shutter button. The other is the trash can button on the back of the camera, sort of top left. While watching the top display, press both buttons at the same time until the display flashes FOR. Let go and then immediately press them both again. You should see the counter on the display reset. So great, we've got the camera reset and the card cleaned up. Let's set some basic settings so you are ready to go out and shoot. The camera has a diopter that lets you adjust the viewfinder. If you wear glasses, you may want to adjust the camera to your vision. If the person who had the camera before you wore glasses, they may have adjusted it. If everything looks a little blurry when you look through the camera and the lens is in focus, try adjusting the camera's diopter, that small dial on the back of the camera, just to the right of the eyepiece. Next step, to set the ISO. What is ISO? It represents how sensitive your camera is to light. The higher the ISO, the more sensitive the camera becomes, which means you can shoot in darker situations, use faster shutter speeds, that kind of thing. Now, there is no such thing as a free lunch, of course. Image quality suffers as you go to higher ISOs. So we try to shoot at the lowest ISO that will allow us to get the photo we need. The D7000 can make beautiful photos even at pretty high ISOs, so don't be afraid to turn that setting up high if you need to. In general, we use the lower settings when we're outside during the day and start turning up the ISO as we move indoors or are shooting at night. The camera's ISO range is from 100 to 6400. Since each doubling of the ISO means a doubling of the camera's sensitivity, ISO 6400 is 64 times more sensitive to light than ISO 100. At the very high settings, the image will not look nearly as good as at those lower settings. Try not to go above 3200 unless it's the only way to get a photo. Typically, outside on a bright day or a sunny day, you might be at ISO 100, 200, 400. As you move indoors into a brightly lit classroom, it might be in the 800, 1600 range. And when you get into darker situations is when you'll start hitting those higher numbers. All right, now let's set the white balance. Different lights look different. Daylight is very different from fluorescent lights, for example. Your own eye makes adjustments to that, but we need to tell the camera what kind of conditions we're shooting under. If your camera is improperly set, your subjects can look like Oompa Loompas from Willy Wonka. Setting the white balance to match the conditions will give you much better image quality. The camera also has an auto setting for white balance. If you're not sure what to set, or will be moving from scene to scene, the auto setting is a good way to go. Autofocus. The lens on your camera needs to focus. You can do that manually by turning the front ring on the lens, but the camera is very good at autofocusing. There are many, many ways to set the camera up for this. Here is a good starting point, though your teacher may suggest other ways. First, you must turn on autofocus on both the lens and the camera, otherwise the camera won't focus. On the left side of the camera is a switch. Turn it to AF. The lens has its own switch. Set it to A as well. There are different ways to configure the autofocus on the camera. Do you want it to lock on a subject and then stop autofocusing, or focus continuously? Do you want to focus on a single point that you set and can adjust, or have it focus on a section of the viewfinder, or even pick where to focus all by itself? Notice that the autofocus button on the side of the camera can also be pressed in. Press and hold that button, and notice on the display on the top of the camera that you see the autofocus menu. A quick word about what we call the command dials. You'll notice two knobs on the front and back of the camera up near the shutter release button. The front command dial sets certain controls, the back dial sets other ones. So, if we want to set our autofocus, we press and hold the button on the side of the camera. We turn the back command dial or control knob while we're still holding that button, and you'll see that the modes change from AFA to AFC to AFS. These are different autofocus modes. AFA is a total auto mode, and we won't use that one. AFC means autofocus continuous. The camera is going to just keep focusing all the time on whatever it's pointed at. This can be great for a moving subject or a sporting event, that kind of thing. AFS means autofocus single. The camera will lock focus on your subject. This means you can focus on something and then recompose the camera as long as you keep pressing the shutter button partway down, and that subject will stay in focus. For now, let's set the camera to AFS. While still holding the AF button on the side of the camera, use the front command knob. This changes the autofocus from a grid and the word auto to a single point. In that grid mode, the camera is deciding what to focus on. It might look for a face, or it might focus on what's closest to the camera, and that may not be what you want to do. So set the camera to that single point, and now the camera will focus on wherever that point is aimed at. Alright, and now we're going to talk about exposure. Exposure equals how much light enters the camera for a photo. The dial on the top left of the camera allows us to pick different ways of setting the exposure. The green auto setting is the point and shoot setting that gives the camera total control of exposure, and we will not use that one. We want to be in control of the pictures we take. To begin, let's use the M setting. M is for manual. This means you will set both the shutter speed, how long the shutter is open, and the aperture, how wide that opening is. These are the two ways we control exposure. Once you understand how that works, you might choose one of the other settings. While setting your shutter speed and aperture in manual mode, use the front command knob for the aperture and the back knob for shutter speed. As you're looking through the camera's viewfinder, you'll see a display at the bottom that shows you the exposure that you're setting. You'll also see a meter, a set of dotted lines with a 0 in the center. As you change aperture and shutter speed, that line will move. Proper exposure is usually when you get that line at or close to the 0. So the line itself, the dotted line itself, disappears and is lined up just under the 0. Remember that if your shutter speed is too slow, your photos will be blurry. A good rule of thumb is to use a shutter speed above 1/100th of a second. You might need to go even faster if your subject is moving or if you're using a big lens. The number at the bottom of the display that represents shutter speed doesn't use the fraction, it just shows the bottom of the fraction. So a 1/100th of a second shutter speed would be displayed as 100. As you can see in the live view, that display is very similar to the view you'd have inside your camera. The same holds true for aperture. The larger the number, the smaller the opening, the less light that gets in. So if we need more light, we go to a smaller number, a larger opening. It can be confusing until you get the hang of it. To get the most light then, we would use a slow shutter speed, a small number, combined with a large opening, a large aperture, also a small number. Take a few test photos, play around with exposure, and you'll start to see what we mean by having exposures that are too dark or too light. Just a few more things on the checklist and then you can get shooting. We want to set the camera to take photos continuously for as long as the shutter button is depressed. The shutter button is that button on the top of the camera that actually takes the picture. The dial around the knob on the top left of the camera sets what we call the motor drive of the camera, how fast or how many pictures the camera will take. For now, set it to CH for continuous high shooting. If you're on an assignment or you're in a place where you want to take a single picture at a time, you don't want to be distracting, you're worried about the noise of the camera, you can change that setting to S for single, and the camera will take just a single photo every time you press the shutter button. We also want to set the image quality. How will that picture be stored on the card and what kind of quality setting? By holding the quality button and turning the front command knob, we have a number of settings available to us. Typically, to begin, we're going to set that to fine, which is the best quality JPEG file setting. If you've been taught about RAW files and want to shoot RAW, that's an option as well. So, phew, that's a long list, a big checklist. But make sure you go through everything on it and make sure your camera is set properly, and then you should be able to get started and not have to worry as much about the technical problems the camera can present. Thanks for taking the time to watch the video. We hope it helps. I'm sure you'll have lots of questions as you start working with the camera, so don't be afraid to ask.